Chapter 15. Goodbye Carlos, September 2002. Well, that sucked. We knew that Carlos was on loan to us, but we'd hoped that our early successes would convince the special agents in charge that we needed Carlos more than anyone else did. No dice. He was headed back home, and he wasn't excited about it. None of us were either. We were convinced we were being screwed in the usual way that certain ATF bosses screw street agents. Carlos was being reassigned simply because someone had the power to reassign him. The truth wasn't far away. Slats, having worked in Miami, was on good terms with the SAC there. But our assistant special agent in charge wasn't. Our ASAC penned the request for Carlos's extension in a terse email that rubbed the Miami boss the wrong way. Carlos's extension was turned down and his reassignment to his home district was expedited, effective October 1st, 2002. His imminent removal presented an imminent challenge: how to extract him from the case without it seeming rash or out of character. The task force had a brainstorming session at the patch. Carlos could have a motorcycle accident. Everyone knew he wasn't much on a bike, just like me. But putting him in the hospital would require a bunch of makeup and effort, and it wasn't likely to justify his disappearance from Arizona. We could arrest him, but we couldn't figure out a way to do it without arresting any other solos. We could say he was ordered to relocate to Tijuana by the Solos brass, but since we knew that there already existed murky channels of communication between the Mexican Solos and the larger biker world, that would be too risky. For a few days, we were at an impasse. To distract ourselves, Carlos and I decided to do Smitty's Porter collection. Slat suggested we do it at Porter's job so as to maximize exposure and lessen the risk of it going bad, which we could not let happen. As an undercover, you have to do your best to control situations while giving the other party the impression they're the one in control. We decided to show up in numbers. That way, we'd be intimidating and deterring. We recruited two of the larger task force agents to join us: Nicholas Buddha Cesaris, who had neck rolls that recalled loaves of white bread, and Chris Elvis Hoffman, a hulking Tempe cop. Porter worked in residential construction. As we approached him, he drew his framing hammer from his belt loop and flipped it so the claw would be on the fending side of a power swing. Gotta love that. We were all openly packing, and Carlos carried my Louisville Slugger. Porter and I spoke. He repeated what Smitty had told me, and that the matter was in the courts. He didn't understand why he should be collected for money that he didn't technically owe. Not yet, anyway. He also called the woman we were ostensibly collecting for Crazy Carol. He was calm and tough, especially considering that, as far as he knew, he was explaining his way out of a beating or worse. I found him believable, and I told him I'd have to ask my boss whether or not we'd be paying him another visit. He said he understood, then thanked me, and we actually shook hands. If I could have, I'd have bought him a beer. I called Smitty later that night from the Verano Circle undercover house and told him what Porter had told us and that he didn't back down or act like a pussy. I said I believed him and let him off the hook. I told Smitty no problem paying him another visit if he wanted me to. Smitty said, "Nah, I trust you, Bird. That Carol's a crazy old bitch anyway." We never heard about Porter again. Smitty's words echoed in my head. I trust you, Bird. The next morning, as Slats sat over his cup of coffee reading the Arizona Republic, he came across a story about a Phoenix landscaper who had been arrested in Chicago for large-scale cocaine trafficking. His last name was Jimenez. As far as the Angels knew, Carlos's last name was Jimenez too. On September 26th, we arranged to meet Smitty at the Inferno for drinks. He sat at the bar with Lydia when Carlos, Timmy, and I walked in. Lydia had her hand on Smitty's thigh, and her eyes were as big as lily pads. He said hi. She smiled at us like a little girl being given lemon drops. They didn't know what we were there to tell them. Smitty said, "Hey boys." Smitty pointed at Dennis, who was playing pool. Dennis held up a bottle of beer. We settled in at the bar and bought a round. Crown Royal and water for Smitty, Cuervo 1800, and ginger ale for Lydia, whatever Dennis was having. Beers for Solo and us. Carlos sat next to Smitty and Timmy and I sat next to Carlos. Smitty asked what we'd been up to. I told him that Timmy and I had a good job in Vegas. that it was easy and that we could get good scratch out of it. Timmy said that for a couple of guys who looked like us, doing collections was something too easy. I agreed. Carlos didn't say anything, just stared at his drink. I said, I caught up with some chick who wants me to do some work for her. This was true. During Operation Riverside, a woman had offered me a murder for hire to knock off her old man. Apparently, he'd been beating her and sniffing her powder, and she was tired of him. Her best friend's on the Laughlin grand jury, and I talked to her. She ran down a list of names, and yours came up. This was also true, to a point. Having good knowledge of the Laughlin case, it was safe to assume that he'd been spoken of during the Nevada grand juries. But I really had met this woman's friend, and she was really on the grand jury. Call it fate, though she hadn't told me anything. And, Lydia said impatiently, the grand jury had been taking its sweet time. There were a ton of witnesses, and the marginal quality of the surveillance footage made it difficult to work with. The case seemed as though it would be cut and dry, but the attorneys were taking their time handing out the indictments. They wanted airtight federal cases before they went to court. There was also some pressure to see what our investigation could add. At that time, no angels had been formally served. Those involved were waiting for the other shoe to drop and the marshals to show up at their doors with warrants and shotguns. I said, and that's it. She just had names, nothing solid. She mentioned Dago Pete and a couple guys named Calvin Schaefer and George Walters. Also information I knew as a Fed, but played it as if I'd heard it in confidence. Smitty said, Schaefer's Casino Cal. He shot some of the Mongols' bitches. George is Joby, skinny guy, mullet. I remembered him from the Flamingo, the Nestle's Quick Rabbit. Well, I told him to get what he could on Pete. I can tell him to listen out for others too. Yeah, do that. Lydia asked Smitty, what do you think, sweetie? I think if those bastards bring me up on Rico's, you and I are moving. Still staring at his beer, Carlos asked, where to? They were the first words he'd spoken since we'd arrived. Lydia announced, Brazil, as if she'd already punched her ticket. Living in Bullhead for as long as she had, I couldn't blame her 1 inch. Smitty looked at me and said, I'll need some help from your connections in Mexico to make that happen. Then he turned to Carlos and asked, what's up, Los? Carlos didn't say anything. Hey, Carlos, you listening to me? Carlos asked, what's that, Smith? What's with you, man? You read the Republic yesterday? Nope, won't read it tomorrow either. Lydia giggled. Well, there was a thing in there about a cousin of mine. He got popped a couple days ago. No shit. Carlos tossed a newspaper clipping down on the table. Smitty looked it over. I'm sorry to hear that, Carlos. For real, man, I'm sorry. It don't matter. He was a piece of shit. But he was into some things, and I helped him out from time to time. Carlos pretended to change the subject. Brazil, huh? Yeah, Smitty didn't bite. We didn't want him to. What are you talking about? I leaned back and looked at Smitty. We're losing Carlos, Smith. What? Smith half stood out of his seat. Lydia let out a little gasp. Dennis looked our way. I was a little jealous. Smitty and Lydia really loved Carlos. I didn't think they'd feel so strongly if I was the one leaving. Carlos said, yeah, I can't hang around here, Smitty. The cops are going to be looking for me. Just questions, but you know, there's going to be some heat. If I stay, I'll be putting my solo brothers at risk. I'll be putting you guys at risk. I can't do that, Lydia said. Oh, honey. Smitty wasn't smiling. He settled back into his chair. He poured back his Crown Royal and signaled for another. He put his hand on Carlos's shoulder. That's the way it is, then that's the way it is. I'll tell the others. Thanks, Smitty, I said. Carlos said, yeah, thanks, Smith. I'll come back when I can. Smitty said seriously, you do that. Make sure you do that. But Carlos never would.